In 2026, the world arrives in the American South. Two cities 600 miles apart will host millions of visitors for the same global tournament. On paper, they share a region. On the ground, they share almost nothing. Miami sits on a strip of limestone between the Atlantic Ocean and the Everglades. It is closer to Havana than to Atlanta. More than 70% of its residents speak Spanish at home. Its skyline was built by Latin American capital. Its port moves more cruise passengers than any other on Earth. Atlanta sits 250 miles from the nearest coast, landlocked in the Georgia Piedmont. Its airport handles more passengers than any facility on the planet, over 90 million a year. Its cultural power was built by Black Southern institutions, civil rights history, and a music industry that shaped global pop culture. One city faces the Caribbean. The other connects the inland south to everywhere. 600 miles apart, two maps, two very different ways of becoming global. Most people think of Miami as a beach, a resort, a postcard of nightlife and palm trees. But behind the beach is one of the busiest ports in the Western Hemisphere, an airport that connects the Americas. And a financial district built on Latin American capital. Most people think of Atlanta as another southern city with a big stadium and a busy highway. But Atlanta is the air traffic hub of an entire continent, a city where black culture built global influence long before any tournament was announced. The 2026 World Cup will be played across 16 venues in 3 countries. 11 of those cities are in the United States. But only 2 of those host cities sit in the deep American South, and they could not be more different from each other. Miami's global connections point south toward Bogotá, São Paulo, and Mexico City. Its financial district, Brickell, hosts more international banking offices than any neighborhood in the country. Walk through most Miami neighborhoods, and the default language you hear is Spanish, not English. Atlanta's connections point everywhere, but mostly inward, across the American continent. The city began as a railroad terminus in 1837. It was literally named for the railroad that founded it. Today, 3 major interstate highways converge here. The city's sprawl follows the roads, not the rivers. And its music, its historically black colleges, and its creative economy made it a cultural capital long before anyone built a stadium. The tournament gives both cities a deadline, a stage, and a question they cannot avoid. What kind of global city is each place trying to prove it is? To answer that, we need to look at the geography that shaped each city. The migration that built their identities, the systems that move people through them every day. And the question of who these cities are really being rebuilt for. This is not a story about a tournament. It is a story about 2 maps and what they reveal about the changing American South. To understand why these cities feel so different, you have to start with the water. What happens when a city is built on a strip of limestone between the ocean and the swamp? Miami is not built on solid ground the way most American cities are. It sits on a narrow ridge of porous limestone between the Atlantic Ocean and the Everglades. To the west, the Everglades press against the city's edge, a shallow freshwater river of grass that blocks any expansion inland. To the east, a chain of barrier islands separates the mainland from the open Atlantic. Miami Beach is not Miami. It is a separate island across the bay. The causeways are not scenic bridges, they are the reason Miami functions at all. Half a dozen causeways cross Biscayne Bay, connecting the mainland to the islands where most tourists spend their time. Downtown Miami sits roughly 6 feet above sea level. The entire metropolitan area is essentially flat. The limestone underneath is porous. Water does not just flow around Miami, it flows through it. This is the layout. A thin mainland wedged between swamp and sea, connected to its islands by a handful of bridges. But geography alone does not explain why this city matters globally. Look at the port. Port Miami is the busiest cruise port on Earth. More than 7 million passengers pass through it every year. But it is not just cruise ships. Port Miami also handles billions of dollars in cargo, much of it bound for Latin America and the Caribbean. Then there is the airport. Miami International handles more international freight than any US airport except JFK. It is the primary air corridor between the United States and Latin America. More flights connect here to the hemisphere than through any other gateway. Most people think of Miami as beaches and nightlife. In reality, it is one of the most important logistics gateways in the Western Hemisphere. Draw the flight routes on a map and the pattern becomes clear. Miami faces south. And now Brightline, a private high-speed rail line, connects Miami's airport to Fort Lauderdale and West Palm Beach in under an hour. It is the only privately operated intercity passenger railroad in the United States, and it runs through a region shaped entirely by water and highway. Now look at the distances. Miami is 228 miles from Havana. It is 662 miles from Atlanta. Bogota is closer to Miami than Chicago is. Nassau is closer than Jacksonville. The map does not lie. Miami does not face north toward the rest of the United States. It faces south toward the Caribbean and Latin America. That orientation is not accidental. It is the product of geography, and it shaped everything that came after. For most of its history, Miami was a small southern resort town. As late as the 1950s, the population of the entire county was under 500,000. Then, in 1959, the Cuban Revolution sent waves of exiles across the Florida Straits. Miami was the nearest US city. Within a generation, Cuban exiles transformed the city. They built businesses, established banks, and created an entire Spanish-language economy. Then came Haitians, Colombians, Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, and Brazilians. Each wave reinforced Miami's position as the threshold between two Americas. By the time the rest of the world noticed, Miami had quietly become something without precedent, a Latin American capital on US soil. For most coastal cities, water is a boundary. For Miami, water is the connector. The bay, the port, the causeways, they all serve the same function. They move people and goods between the mainland, the islands, the Caribbean, and the wider Americas. And then there is the Everglades, the other force that shaped Miami, the one most visitors never think about. The Everglades is a slow-moving freshwater river, 60 miles wide, that flows from Lake Okeechobee south to Florida Bay. It defines Miami's western boundary. The city cannot sprawl inland because the wetland is there, and the drinking water underneath depends on it. So Miami is squeezed between the ocean and the swamp, between the United States and the Caribbean. That squeeze forced the city upward and outward across the water. It is why Miami feels so dense, so vertical, so compressed. And it is why, when the world arrives in 2026, visitors will cross causeways, pass through a port built on an island. And land at an airport whose busiest routes all point toward Latin America. The water is not decoration here. It is the infrastructure. It is the identity. It is the reason this city faces the direction it does. The water made Miami reachable, but it was migration that made it Latin American. Walk through Little Havana and the street signs are in Spanish. The coffee is cortadito. The music drifts from open windows. This is not a tourist district performing Latin culture. It is the living centre of a city where English is the second language. More than 70% of Miami-Dade residents speak Spanish at home. That is not diversity branding, it is demography. Miami's transformation began in 1959, when the first wave of Cuban exiles arrived after the revolution. They settled in neighborhoods west of downtown and built businesses, schools and churches in Spanish. Within a generation, Little Havana was not a nickname. It was a description. Then came Haitians in the 70s, Colombians and Nicaraguans in the 80s, Venezuelans and Brazilians after the turn of the century. Each wave added a new layer. Miami did not become generically multicultural. It became specifically Latin American, with distinct communities from across the hemisphere living side by side. In large parts of the city, you can live, work, bank and raise children without ever speaking English. Spanish is not the minority language here. It is the default. Miami hosts more Latin American consulates than any other US city. Dozens of countries maintain trade offices within a few blocks of Brickell Avenue. And that brings us to Brickell, the part of Miami that makes the financial connection visible. Brickell became a magnet for Latin American capital not because of tax incentives alone. Miami already had the legal firms, the bilingual bankers, and the financial infrastructure that made it feel like an extension of São Paulo or Bogotá. When political instability or currency crises hit Latin America, the money moved north, and it stopped in Miami before going anywhere else. The result is a financial district where the skyline itself is a monument to hemispheric capital. These towers were not built for tourists. They were built for investors who see Miami as the front door to the United States. But Miami's Latin American identity does not live only in the financial towers. A few miles north of Brickell, there is a neighborhood that tells the other side of the story. Wynwood was once a garment warehouse district. In the early 2000s, a developer began inviting street artists to cover the empty walls. Within a decade, it became one of the most recognizable art districts in the Americas. Today, the murals rotate with the seasons. Galleries share walls with cafes and design studios. The neighborhood pulses with creative energy drawn from across the Caribbean and Latin America. But the transformation came with a cost. As galleries and boutiques moved in, rents climbed. Many of the Puerto Rican and Central American families who lived here for decades were priced out. Wynwood is celebrated as Miami's creative showcase. But the people who gave the neighborhood its original character are often the ones who can no longer afford to stay. This is the gap that defines Miami. The world sees the beach. It sees the pastel hotels and the nightlife. But the engine that made this city global has almost nothing to do with tourism. Miami's global function is built on diaspora networks, trade corridors, and bilingual infrastructure. The beach is the postcard. The neighborhoods are the city. When millions of visitors arrive for the World Cup, many will land expecting the Miami of Instagram. The cocktails, the sunsets, the waterfront clubs. What they will find, if they walk beyond the causeway, is a city that already belongs to Latin America, and has for decades. Miami became global by facing south. Atlanta became global by facing everywhere at once, from the middle of the continent. Atlanta has no river worth shipping on, no coastline, and no natural harbour. It exists because of a surveyor's stake driven into red Georgia clay in 1837, marking the endpoint of a railroad line. The city was literally named Terminus, before it was called Marthasville, and then Atlanta. Miami was shaped by water. Atlanta was shaped by a decision about where to end a railroad. The city sits in the Georgia Piedmont, a rolling plateau of red clay between the Appalachian foothills and the coastal plain. Atlanta sits over 1,000 feet above sea level. Miami barely reaches 6. To the north, the foothills, to the south, the flat coastal plain. Atlanta sits exactly where those two worlds meet. By the 1840s, 3 rail lines converged here, not because of a river or a port, but because the terrain allowed the cheapest route inland. That logic, cheapest route, central position, became Atlanta's permanent operating system. 3 interstate highways converge in Atlanta. I-75, I-85 and I-20 all cross through downtown. At the intersection known as Spaghetti Junction, 5 levels of highway stack on top of each other. The highway system did not just connect Atlanta, it defined its shape, a metropolis that sprawls across nearly 6,000 square miles. Atlanta became one of the most car-dependent major cities in the country. The highway is not an option here, it is the system. But the highways only tell half the story. The real engine of Atlanta's global reach sits 10 miles south of downtown. Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport handles over 90 million passengers a year. It has been the busiest airport on Earth for most of the last quarter century. And here is what most people do not realize. Atlanta is not the busiest airport because it is a major destination. Its inland position makes it the optimal connecting hub for domestic flights. If you are flying between 2 mid-sized American cities, there is a good chance your route passes through Atlanta. Most passengers passing through Hartsfield-Jackson never leave the terminal. They land, transfer and fly out, and Atlanta makes the connection possible. The airport has 7 concourses, over 200 gates and its own underground rail system to move people between them. On its busiest days, more than 250,000 people pass through. The airport functions like a small city inside a city. In 1837, Atlanta was where the railroad ended. Today, it is where the flights connect. The logic has not changed, only the scale. And that same logic is now reshaping the city from the inside out. The rail yards that once made Atlanta a freight hub are now some of the most valuable redevelopment land in the southeast. The Gulch, a 50-acre depression of old rail infrastructure in the centre of downtown, is becoming Centennial Yards, one of the largest mixed-use developments in the country. Atlanta sits between 2 versions of itself, the old agricultural South where cotton and rail shaped everything, and a modern logistics and services economy built on speed. The metro area is now one of the largest logistics corridors in the United States. Warehouses, distribution centres and freight operations ring the city. Over a dozen Fortune 500 companies are headquartered here. The reason is always the same: connectivity. Atlanta was never built to be arrived at. It was built to be passed through, and that is precisely what made it powerful. Miami pulls people toward the water, Atlanta pulls them through, on their way somewhere else, until they realize the somewhere else is Atlanta. The metro area has added over 1 million residents in the last 15 years. People keep coming, drawn by jobs, by cost, and by a city that connects to everywhere. The tension between Old South and New South is visible on nearly every block, a brick church beside a co-working space. A rail spur turned into a walking trail. The Beltline, the 22-mile loop of converted rail corridors, is turning old freight infrastructure into public space. Whether that serves everyone equally is another question. When the world arrives in 2026, it will land at an airport built on a railroad's logic and move through a city that was designed to keep things moving. Visitors will ride MARTA, navigate the highways, walk through neighborhoods they have only seen on screens. They will feel the scale. But the highways and the airport explain how Atlanta moves people. They do not explain what Atlanta sounds like. Before the airport made Atlanta a hub, black institutions, civic leaders, and musicians had already given the city a voice that carried across the world. How did a landlocked southern city become one of the most influential cultural capitals on the planet? The previous chapter explained how Atlanta moves people, but long before the airport made this city a hub, Atlanta was already exporting something the world wanted. Not cargo, not passengers, culture. Atlanta became a global city through sound before it became one through connectivity. The lineage starts in the churches. Atlanta's black congregations built a gospel tradition that shaped rhythm and blues across the entire country. By the 1990s, Atlanta's studios were producing some of the most influential hip-hop on the planet. Outkast, Goody Mob, Organized Noise, the city defined an entire regional sound. Today, Atlanta is the recording capital of the American South. Trap music, which reshaped global pop, was born in these neighborhoods. From gospel to R&B to hip-hop to trap, the genres kept changing. The origin point did not. But music is only one layer. Atlanta's cultural authority was built on something deeper, civic leadership rooted in the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on Auburn Avenue in 1929. The house still stands, so does the church where he preached 2 blocks away. Atlanta did not just participate in the civil rights movement, it organized it. The city's black institutions provided the infrastructure, churches, colleges, newspapers, legal networks, that made sustained resistance possible. And at the center of that infrastructure sits the Atlanta University Center, the largest consortium of historically black colleges and universities in the United States. Morehouse, Spelman, Clark Atlanta. These campuses sit just west of downtown within walking distance of each other. Together, they have produced more black graduates in law, medicine, business, and public service than any single institution in the country. This is not an entertainment pipeline, it is a civic one. Outsiders often reduce Atlanta to entertainment, music, sports, nightlife, but the deeper structure is institutional. Georgia now hosts more major film and television productions than nearly any other state. Most of that industry is anchored in Atlanta, drawn by infrastructure, tax incentives, and a creative workforce that was already here. The same city that shaped global pop culture also has one of the highest concentrations of black-owned businesses and black corporate leadership in the United States. Music opened the door, institutions built the house. Atlanta's global influence was cultural long before the airport made it logistical. Miami moves money across water. Atlanta moves culture through air. But both cities are now asking the same question. When millions of visitors arrive at once, which systems actually hold the city together? Forget the stadiums for a moment. When millions of visitors arrive for the same event, the most important architecture is not the venue. It is the airport terminal, the highway interchange, the train platform and the bridge. The way a city moves you is the first thing it tells you about itself. Start where every visitor starts, at the airport. Hartsfield-Jackson in Atlanta handles more passengers than any airport on Earth, over 90 million a year. Its design is unusual. Instead of scattered terminals, it uses one long spine connected by an underground train, efficient for connections. Disorienting if you have never seen it before. A first-time visitor lands, follows the signs underground, rides a train between concourses and emerges into a city they cannot see from the gate. Miami International is a different animal, smaller in raw passenger volume but built for international reach. More flights connect through MIA to Latin America and the Caribbean than through any other US airport. The arrivals hall sounds like a continent, not a country. And Miami is adding something no other US host city has, a direct high-speed rail link between the airport and the downtown entertainment corridor. Brightline already connects Miami to Fort Lauderdale and West Palm Beach. The airport station is being positioned as a gateway for World Cup visitors arriving from across South Florida. One airport moves you underground, the other is building a rail line above ground to get you downtown. Same goal, opposite engineering. Once you leave Miami's airport, the city's geography takes over. You cross water to get almost anywhere. The causeways connecting the mainland to Miami Beach are not scenic detours. They are the city's circulatory system, and during a global event they become its bottleneck. Miami's Metrorail runs a single elevated line through the urban core. It connects the airport to downtown. But its reach stops well short of where most visitors will need to go. And then there is the port. Port Miami handles more cruise passengers than any facility on Earth. During the tournament, it becomes another arrival corridor, feeding visitors into a city already at capacity. In Miami, movement means water. Every route crosses it, circles it, or depends on it. Atlanta's movement system is the opposite. There is no water to cross. The challenge is distance. Atlanta's metro area spreads across nearly 6,000 square miles. The city proper is a small fraction of that. Most of the region lives beyond the reach of rail. MARTA, Atlanta's rail system, runs 4 lines through the urban core and connects directly to the airport, but it covers only 2 of the region's counties. That means millions of Metro Atlanta residents, and most visiting fans staying outside the core, depend on highways and rideshare to reach the venues. Atlanta was built around the car. Its highways converge downtown in a tangle that locals navigate by instinct and visitors navigate by prayer. Miami's problem is too much water between destinations. Atlanta's problem is too much land. The World Cup does not gently arrive. It stress tests every system at once. Both cities are planning temporary transit expansions, dedicated pedestrian corridors, and fan zones that redirect foot traffic through neighbourhoods that normally see a fraction of this volume. In Atlanta, match-day logistics will funnel tens of thousands of fans from MARTA stations through a corridor that did not exist 5 years ago, across. The Centennial Yards development site and into the stadium district. In Miami, the route from downtown to the stadium passes through Overtown and Liberty City, neighborhoods with deep histories and limited public transit options of their own. Behind the scenes, both cities are coordinating freight delivery windows, emergency access routes and security perimeters that visitors will never notice, unless they fail. This is the part of a global event no highlight reel captures. The infrastructure that holds a city together when the whole world shows up at once. By now, the two maps are clear. Miami faces the water, its port, its causeways, its airport. And its neighbourhoods all orient south, toward the Caribbean, toward Latin America. Atlanta faces inward and upward. Its airport, its highways, and its cultural institutions connect the interior of the continent to everywhere else. But maps only explain how cities connect. They do not explain what it feels like to actually move through them. Millions of visitors will cross causeways, ride trains, navigate highways, and walk into neighbourhoods they have never seen. The systems they pass through will be the first and last things they remember. So the question shifts from what these cities are to how they actually work, who they were built to serve, and what the world will see that locals have known all along. Both cities can move the crowds. The harder question is what happens to the neighbourhoods those systems pass through. When a city rebuilds itself for a global audience, who is it really building for? In both cities, billions of dollars are reshaping downtown districts, transit corridors, and public spaces. The question is not whether the transformation is impressive, it is who the new city is designed to welcome and who it quietly displaces. The skyline changes first, the neighbourhoods feel it last. In downtown Atlanta, a 50-acre rail yard is being converted into one of the largest mixed-use developments in the American South. Centennial Yards is projected to cost over $5 billion. It is positioned as the front door to the World Cup in Atlanta. Hotels, offices, retail and public plazas designed to welcome millions of visitors within walking distance of the stadium. But immediately next to the project sits Vine City, one of Atlanta's historically black neighborhoods. Over the past 2 decades, Vine City has lost a significant share of its residents as surrounding property values climbed. The World Cup is not causing the displacement, but the deadline is accelerating forces that were already in motion. A few miles east, the Atlanta Beltline tells a similar story from a different angle. The Beltline was designed as a 22-mile loop connecting 45 neighborhoods through trails, transit, and public parks. It was supposed to reconnect fragmented communities. The original plan included thousands of units of affordable housing. But property values along completed sections have risen sharply. The affordable housing delivery has lagged behind the commitment. The greenway that was built to connect neighbourhoods is also changing which neighbourhoods can afford to stay. "600 miles south, Miami's World Cup corridor passes directly through Overtown. Overtown was once the cultural centre of Black Miami, home to hotels, jazz clubs, and a thriving business district in the mid-20th century. Highway construction in the 1960s bisected the neighbourhood, displacing thousands of families and severing the commercial spine. Now billion-dollar projects surround what remains. Luxury towers rise on three sides of a community that never fully recovered from the first disruption. The World Cup brings investment, but Overtown's residents have seen investment arrive before and watched it pass them by. A few blocks north, Wynwood tells the same story at a different speed. 20 years ago, this was a warehouse district. Artists moved in because the rent was cheap and the walls were empty. The murals became famous, the neighbourhood became a brand. Property values in parts of Wynwood have more than tripled in the past decade. Many of the artists who made Wynwood desirable can no longer afford to work there. The culture that created the value is being priced out by the value it created. None of this means the investment is unwelcome. New parks, wider sidewalks, better transit, these are genuine improvements. Public space that did not exist a decade ago now connects districts that were separated by highways and rail yards. But in both cities the question is the same. Who can afford to live in the neighbourhood that the improvement creates? Atlanta builds a greenway. Property values rise, Miami rebuilds a corridor, long-term residents watch from the margin. The pattern is not unique to these cities, but the World Cup makes it visible on a global stage, and impossible to postpone. Both cities are investing in a version of themselves they want the world to see. The question is whether that version has room for the people who built it. After the world leaves, which version of each city will remain? Every global event leaves behind two things: the infrastructure that was built for visitors and the city that has to live with it. The real test is not the opening ceremony, it is the Tuesday morning 6 months later. In Miami, the Brightline rail expansion was planned years before the tournament was awarded. In Atlanta, Centennial Yards, a 50-acre mixed-use district rising from an old downtown rail gulch, was already in development. The World Cup did not create these projects, it accelerated them. The tournament's most lasting legacy may not be stadiums or fan zones. It may be transit corridors and real estate decisions that were already in motion, now locked to a deadline the whole world was watching. But infrastructure is only half the story. Miami's Latin American networks, the banks, the consulates, the family ties stretching to Bogotá and Caracas and Santo Domingo, existed decades before the tournament, and will operate decades after. Atlanta's historically black colleges, its music studios, its civil rights institutions, none of them depend on a global sporting event to matter. The longer arcs will not pause for any tournament. Miami sits on porous limestone barely above sea level. Climate projections suggest measurable tidal flooding increases by mid-century. Growth pressure keeps pushing against the Everglades boundary. Atlanta faces a different challenge, managing sprawl across a metro area that may add another 1 million residents within a generation. While the Beltline loop remains years from completion, the World Cup accelerates these timelines. It does not resolve them. The event does not change what these cities are, it reveals what they already were, and forces the question of what they want to become. Miami will keep facing the water, Atlanta will keep connecting the interior. The event passes, the maps remain. Miami sits on a strip of limestone between the Atlantic and the Everglades, facing the Caribbean. Atlanta sits 250 miles from the nearest coast, connected to the world through runways and rail. 600 miles apart, one shaped by water, Latin America and capital, the other by airports, highways and black southern cultural reach. They share a region and a language. On the ground, they share almost nothing else. Miami's global power comes from water, a port that moves the hemisphere, an airport that connects the Americas, and a diaspora that turned a beach town into a Latin American capital inside the United States. Atlanta's global power comes from the ground, a railroad junction that became the busiest airport on Earth. A highway convergence that became a logistics center, and a black cultural tradition that gave the South a voice the world recognizes. Together, these two cities handle more international passengers, more cruise travelers, and more connecting flights than any other pair in the Western Hemisphere. The American South, through these two gateways alone, is one of the most globally connected regions on Earth. The South is not inward-facing, it never was. Through Miami, it faces the Caribbean, Latin America, and every capital that moves money across oceans. Through Atlanta, it connects the interior of the continent to Africa, to Europe, and to everywhere a plane can land in a single flight. The 2026 tournament will bring the cameras, the crowds, and the attention. But the stadiums are not the story. The story is two maps, two ways a southern city can face outward, connect to the world, and wrestle with the question of who it is becoming. When the matches end and the visitors leave, the causeways will still cross Biscayne Bay. And the planes will still land at Hartsfield-Jackson. The maps were always there, it just took a global deadline to make them impossible to ignore. If two cities in the same region can become global in such different ways, what else do we misunderstand about the places we think we know? The South is not one story, it is at least two. For maps, related episodes, and the Travelodic Atlas collection, check the pinned comment.